This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
I'm sure you will find this part of my castle more inviting.
Well, rather. It's quite different from outside. Oh, and the fire, it's so cheerful.
I didn't know but that you might be hungry.
Thank you, that's very kind of you. But I'm a bit worried about my luggage. You see, all your papers were in...
I took the liberty of having your luggage brought up. Allow me.
Oh, yes. Thanks.
I trust you have kept your coming here a secret.
I've followed your instructions implicitly.
Excellent, Mr. Enfield. Excellent. And now, if you're not too fatigued, I would like to discuss the lease on Carfax Abbey.
Oh, yes. Everything is in order, awaiting your signature. Well, here's the lease. Oh, I hope I've brought enough labels for your luggage.
I'm taking with me only 3 boxes.
Very well.
I have chartered a ship to take us to England. We will be leaving tomorrow evening.
Everything will be ready.
I hope you will find this comfortable.
Thanks. It looks very inviting. Ouch. Oh, it's nothing serious, just a small cut from that paper clip. It's just a scratch.
This is very old wine. I hope you will like it.
Aren't you drinking?
I never drink. Why?
Well, it's delicious.
And now I'll leave you.
Well, good night.
Good night, Mr. Renfield.
Place to Be Nation, welcome to an extension, if you will, a new beginning of a current show here on the Place to Be Nation pop feed. My name is Scott Criscuolo. If you've been paying attention to the pop feed, thanks for your support. It's good to have you. Don't go anywhere. More great stuff to come. If you're new to the Place to Be Nation pop feed, or you're new to placetobenation.com, welcome. It's great to have you. Got a lot of great stuff, don't we? Written stuff, and of course wonderful podcasts on both of our feeds, the Place to Be Nation pop feed and the Place to Be Nation wrestling feed. 2 different tastes, all the same great talent. What I'm doing here tonight, and for the foreseeable future for almost all of the talent here at placetobenation.com and the pop feed, you see a show, if you're familiar with the feed, you see a show that comes up, a podblast, now and again called Pop Goes the Movies. And what it is 1 or 2 or 3 members of our fine staff, unbelievable talent we have here, the Andy Athertons, the Jenny Smiths, the Tim Caples, all of the great guys and gals, the Miranda Bertholds, all the great talent we have here at Place to Be Nation, and other feeds that visit us. what we do on Pop Goes the Movies is we review and talk about a current movie that is out right now. If you've heard my voice, I've been on a couple. I've been on Rocket Man, which was the biopic about Elton John. I was on about It Chapter 2 and a bunch of other great Pop Goes the Movies shows that a lot of our talent has done, going over great movies. So I got to thinking, particularly with all of the great streaming services that are coming out now or are already out. Of course, Disney Plus, which as of, if you're listening to this on the premiere day, we still got, about a month and a half away from that. If you're listening to it well past that, it may already be out. I think Warner Brothers is doing one. NBC Universal's doing one, or NBC, of course. And, of course, we already have Netflix and Hulu, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought to myself, what about not just doing recaps and reviews of current films, but let's go back in time and dust off some of the great movies of the past. The Godfather, or, I don't know, Kramer versus Kramer, or Star Wars, or, something like that, or, great horror movies. Speaking of horror movies, we'll be talking about that tonight. So this is the premiere episode of a brand new show called Pop Goes the Classics. Same concept as Pop Goes the Movies, but instead of current films, we're going to be talking about classic old school films. And we're going back. It could go as far back. Hey, if somebody wants to do Birth of a Nation, we're all for it. But we wanted to do the first episodes this month here in October of Ting It. But please, feel free, if you're listening to it a year later, keep listening, because this show is still great, as is all the other great ones here on the Place to Be Nation Pop feed. So don't worry about the date. But I was thinking to myself, it is October, which means, of course, it is horror month or Halloween month. So why don't we premiere Pop Goes the Classics with a classic horror film? What horror film should I do? Well, if you listen to a great show that's on one of our sister feeds, we've already done Halloween, although we may do it here too. Halloween is my favorite horror movie of all time. However, we've also got The Exorcist, The Omen, lots of great horror movies of the past. Of course, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc. I wanted to go even further back. So on this episode, this premiere episode of Pop Goes the Classics, we're going to go back to February of 1931. Yes, that far back. For the first horror film of what is commonly known as the Universal Monsters franchise. What is that? Well, before we get into the movie, why don't we get into a little history? Everybody knows Universal Pictures. Universal Pictures was started in the 1910s by Carl Laemmle and his family. And probably some of the first movies they did were a lot of thrillers and some musicals. But they hadn't really set their feet on something special, something different. Well, Carl Laemmle Sr., who was a German, built a huge studio in 1923, Universal Studios, and of course Universal Studios now is at theme parks, etc. They're an icon of the movie business. But it was his son, Carl Laemmle Jr., that actually got the ball rolling on what would end up becoming the first verse, if you will. I mean, we talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Star Wars universe and the Monster Verse, which is right now Godzilla, Kong Skull Island, and Godzilla King of the Monsters. And that's continuing. The DC universe. Not the animated, although that's a universe too, but the movies. Man of Steel and Dawn of Justice, Wonder Woman, etc. But the first real verse, if you will, was the classic Monsters universe from Universal Pictures that started, well, it technically started in the 1920s, but usually the movie that I'm going to do tonight for you really is probably the first one that kicked it off, and it lasted for 25 years, from 1931 until 1956. And tonight, we're going to do the first one, Dracula. Yes, the Bela Lugosi Dracula from 1931. The horror movie that started it all. Now, when you talk about horror movies, the first official horror movie, well, I mean, there were some silent films back in the day. In the 1910s, there was probably a couple of Frankensteinish movies. They were called The Monster. And there was one Wolfman-type werewolf silent film in the early 1910s. Probably the first, I would say, high-profile horror film was probably Nosferatu, which came out in 1922. Nosferatu, of course, was the film about the vampire that was on a boat going to London, and he escaped, and he was the creepy, Max Schreck, and he was the creepy one with the long hands and the big nose and the big eyes, and he was kind of hunched. It wasn't Dracula, it was just a vampire. And, of course, they remade it for you horror diehards. Of course, it was remade in 1979. German director Werner Herzog redid it with Klaus Kinski played Count Nosferatu. It was actually very good. It's got that kind of European, weird kind of shooting look with it kind of grainy and kind of kooky music and stuff that us horror fans like get into. Stuff like Dario Argento did and Mario Bava back in the day and Fulci in the 60s. This movie came out in the late 70s, though. Anyway, I digress. So, Carl Laemmle Jr. at Universal Pictures, who was head of production, the son of Carl Laemmle Sr., the founder of Universal, decided, you know what, I think we need to corner the market on something. So, he decided, heck, I'm going to corner the market on horror. And so in 1931, now, you could technically say there was a few horror-ish movies in the 20s. I mean, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the original Phantom of the Opera. That's the one, of course, that has the classic scene of the face with no nose, and that came out in 1925. They also did The Cat and the Canary, The Man Who Laughs. The Man Who Laughs, which came out in November of 1928, is a big deal because it's about a man who had an illness that gave him a perpetual smile. Check it out. The movie's called The Man Who Laughs, and as a matter of fact, that character is what Bob Kane based the Joker on in Batman comics. So, just to let you know that. Or the Batman comics was based. I'm not sure if it was Bob Kane, but it was based on this character in the movie The Man Who Laughs. But Carl Laemmle Jr. decided to take Bram Stoker's Dracula and make it into a big-time feature film for Universal Pictures. And so it was based on Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, and in 1924 it was actually a Broadway play, which not many people realized. It was done by Hamilton Dean and John Balderston. Of course, it starred Bela Lugosi, and of course Edward Van Sloan, who played Van Helsing, and he would play a Van Helsing-type character throughout a myriad of Universal monster movies. Of course, to give you a backstory, Renfield, we all know the character Renfield, Renfield was a solicitor traveling to Count Dracula's castle in Transylvania, and of course, en route, he sticks his head out the window to ask the driver to slow down, and sees the driver has disappeared, and a bat is leading the horses. Of course, he goes and visits the Count, doesn't know the Count's a vampire, and Renfield faints as a bat appears. Dracula hypnotizes him, Dracula's three wives close in, and Renfield gets attacked by Dracula himself, and of course, we all know Renfield goes crazy and loves rats. And of course, throughout the movie, Dracula, causes havoc with all of the characters, including a man named Seward and his daughter Mina, her fiancé John Harker, and her friend Lucy. Mina and Lucy, of course, Dracula wanted to, break a piece off of, in essence. But the guy who was not in on it, but kind of knew what was going on, was, of course, Professor Van Helsing. Meanwhile, Renfield has gone crazy. He's obsessed with eating flies and spiders. He analyzes Renfield's blood and discovers the obsession, starts talking about vampires. And then Renfield begs Seward to send him away, claiming his nightly cries may disturb Mina's dreams. Dracula visits Mina and bites her. The next evening, Dracula enters for a visit. Van Helsing and Harker notice that he does not have a reflection. When Van Helsing reveals this to Dracula, he smashes the mirror and leaves. And we figure out that Dracula is the bad guy. Anyway, the story continues. And in the end, Dracula is forced to sleep in his coffin during the daylight while he's hunted by Van Helsing. Van Helsing stakes Dracula in the heart. And Mina returns to normal. By the way, Renfield is pushed down the stairs, breaks his neck, and dies. So, that's in a nutshell. The best part about the Universal Pictures back in the day is they were very short. And these horror movies back in the day were very easy to watch. They're all between 75 and 95 minutes. I mean, they're quick watches. I think the longest movie I've watched to this point in the Universal collection is probably Son of Frankenstein, which is like 99 minutes. That also has Basil Rathbone in it, one of the greatest actors of all time, so, more time for him to speak and have more speaking parts. To give you a little background, we don't want to go into the whole movie itself, but we talked about Nosferatu earlier on. Now, Bram Stoker's novel had already been filmed without permission as Nosferatu. Bram's widow sued for plagiarism. The courts decided in her favor, essentially ordering that all prints of Nosferatu be destroyed. Of course, eventually they found one, and you can get it now on Blu-ray. Carl Laemmle Jr. saw the box office potential in Dracula and legally acquired the novel's film rights. Initially, he wanted Dracula to be a spectacle on a scale with two films I mentioned earlier, Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera, of course. Dracula, as I mentioned, was a huge hit on Broadway about 7 years earlier. And as the production gained momentum, that's kind of what they wanted to do. What about casting? Where did Bela Lugosi, who was a Hungarian actor, get the shot? He was Dracula on Broadway. But Laemmle was not crazy about him. He wanted American actors who had clear accents. Bela Lugosi's accent, of course, is very thick Hungarian. So they were thinking of guys like Paul Muni, Chester Morris, Ian Keith. Lugosi, again, played the role on Broadway and happened to be in L.A. touring with Dracula when the film was being cast. Lugosi lobbied hard and won the executives over. And this kind of is what haunted Bela Lugosi for the rest of his career and his life. He lowballed himself just to get the job. He made $3,500 for 7 weeks of work. That means he was making $500 a week as the lead actor in the film, just to get the part. So when they saw that, he'd work on the cheap. Oh, hell, why not? Who knows? Who cares that his accent's so thick we don't understand it? Speaking of Hungarians, the peasants at the beginning are Hungarian. Because Bram Stoker, when he wrote the original novel, the Borgo Pass, which is in the film, was near Transylvania and modern Hungary. This part of the world was then part of the kingdom and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's now, of course, part of Romania. The film's dramatics, again, it's a black and white film, so it uses a lot of music and shadows. We're not talking slasher films, fans. We're not talking, Jason Voorhees slashing a throat, or putting someone in a sleeping bag and swinging him like a bat, or Michael Myers stabbing Bob with a knife and having him hang off a cabinet door. Not even close. Not even close. In fact, Dracula, Bela Lugosi didn't even wear fangs. That came way later when Hammer Horror took over and did Dracula in the 60s with Christopher Lee in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then we saw a lot of fangs and a lot of drooling blood and everything and all that. But Bela Lugosi just had teeth. And back then it was all about camera angles and shooting and lighting. And that's what made a great horror movie in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And that's what made these Universal horror franchise so great. Because we're relying on suspense, not just gore. And gore's great. We love Hostel. We love, us horror fans love, intestines on the floor and guts and stuff. But sometimes we like to be entertained by suspense, thriller, jump scares, the feeling of music and darkness, and you're not sure, what's coming next. That's the kind of stuff we like. That's the kind of early horror that we got from the Universal Monster collection and the Universal Monster universe. I hate to use Universal and universe, but that's kind of how it is. And the effects for Dracula and for some of the early films are tremendous. Fog, lighting, and yes, rubber bats on rubber bands. I mean, come on, people. It's 1930. 1931. We got to cut some slack. By the way, the music. Let's talk about the music for a minute. Well, you know what? Let me get back to the music. The film also employs extended periods of silence and character close-ups. As I mentioned, a lot of close-ups of Bela Lugosi. But we're not talking about dun, 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 crazy loud music. It was just very subtle. As a matter of fact, there were times in the film there was no music at all. You just heard silence. Particularly when there's the scene where Renfield, before he goes crazy, is sitting at a table. Because remember, he was a real estate guy, and he was visiting Dracula at his castle. And he was invited to eat. And Dracula's sitting there, and he was very charismatic. And Renfield cut his finger with a paperclip and was bleeding. Now, of course, they made the blood so, friggin' dramatic. It's a paper clip. It's not like you got cut with a machete, But for dramatic purposes, we had this big blood glump on his finger, and all of a sudden Dracula looks at it like you and I look at a T-bone steak. Or for vegans, eggs? I don't know. No, they don't eat eggs either. Anyway, whatever vegans look at to get turned on food-wise. But for us meat eaters, looking at a nice T-bone or a strip steak, that's what Dracula was looking at when he was looking at Renfield's bloody finger. But instead of, this dun, 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 all this dramatic music, it was just silence. Because you as the viewer knows what Dracula's looking at. He's like, man, I'm friggin' hungry. And that's the dramatics of it. And that's what made these movies so great. We weren't slapped in the face with a lot of effects. It was amazing. And that's why I love, and you as fans will love watching these Universal Monster Classics, because it's all about suspense. And it's all about getting excited and scared without needing, a head cut off or guts ripped out or something. Music. Due to the cost of adding an original music score to the film soundtrack, no score had ever specifically been composed for the film. The music heard during the opening credits, is actually an excerpt from Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky. I bet you didn't know that. It was reused in 1932 for another Universal horror film, The Mummy, and we'll talk about The Mummy in a future Pop Goes the Classics episode. During the theater scene, when Dracula meets Dr. Seward, Harker, Mina, and Lucy, the end of the overture to Wagner's, I'm not even going to try to say this right, Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, can also be heard, as well as the dark opening of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony in B minor. So it didn't even have its own soundtrack. Isn't that kind of bonkers? You know what I'm saying? When the film finally premiered at the Roxy in New York on February 12th, 1931, which was released 2 days later throughout the rest of the United States, newspapers reported that members of the audiences fainted at the shock at the horror on the screen. This publicity, shrewdly orchestrated by the film studio, helped ensure people to come see the film, if for no other reason than curiosity. Now, Dracula, again, was such a big gamble for a major studio like Universal to undertake. In spite of the literary credentials of the source material, it was uncertain if an American audience was prepared for a serious, full-length, supernatural, European-feeling thriller. Though America had been exposed to other chillers before, like The Cat and the Canary, which is a very scary film from 1927, this was a horror story with no comic relief or trick ending that downplayed the supernatural. This was legit from beginning to end. No gaffes. Nervous executives breathed a collective sigh of relief when Dracula proved to be a huge box office sensation. Within 48 hours of its opening at the Roxy, it sold 50,000 tickets, building a momentum that culminated in a $700,000 profit, the largest of Universal's 1931 releases. $700,000 in 1931 is no small feat. That's probably several million, probably in the, maybe, I don't know, hundreds of millions today? I'm not sure. It was well received by critics, and just universally loved, no pun intended. Now, the film originally was 85 minutes long. When it was reissued 5 years later, it came out again in 1936, the production code was enforced. This is before the days of, rated G, PG, R. 2 scenes are known to have been censored. The most significant deletion was an epilogue, which played only during the film's initial run. Edward Van Sloan, the actor that played Van Helsing, appeared in a curtain speech and informed the audience, "Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen, a word before you go. We hope the memories of Dracula and Renfield won't give you bad dreams, so just a word of reassurance. When you get home tonight, and the lights have been turned out, and you are afraid to look behind the curtains, and you dread to see a face appear at the window, why, just pull yourself together and remember that after all, there are such things as vampires." That was removed out of fear that the supernatural existed. People were very narrow-minded back then. And then there's audio of Dracula's off-camera death groans at the end of the film, at the part where Van Helsing stakes him. Plus, there's screams of Renfield when his neck snapped. There was actually a neck-snapping noise, too. That's crazy for 1931. They were restored by MCA Universal for its DVD releases. And actually, if you get the Blu-ray collection now, those are returned. So, today, Dracula and Bela Lugosi, widely regarded as a classic of the era and its genre. In 2000, it was selected for preservation by the U.S. National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. It's 79th on Bravo's countdown of the 100 scariest movie moments. Now, there has been a ton of Draculas since. There's, again, Dracula adaptations all over the place. Universal did 7 films about Dracula, or with Dracula in it, or alluding to Dracula. We had the original. By the way, there was and this happened a lot back in the day, before I continue. About a month later, a version was released of Dracula, exact same movie, exact same set, in Spanish. Different actors. In fact, the actor that played Dracula looked a hell of a lot like Bela Lugosi, but he was, I don't know if he was Mexican. I don't know his nationality, but he was, looked just like him. So that came out, separate movie. I thought, and I didn't realize that when I was younger, I thought it was just the Bela Lugosi movie dubbed, but it wasn't. Different actors acting in Spanish. It's pretty cool. Universal also did Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, which had Dracula in it, House of Dracula. Of course, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. That was the last one of the Universal Monsterverse that had Dracula in it. In fact, that's the only other one that Bela Lugosi played Dracula. Believe it or not, Bela Lugosi only played Dracula twice. He's been in other Universal Monster films, but he was only Dracula twice. In Dracula and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He played Dracula. By the way, Carlos Valerias was the actor that played Dracula in the Spanish version. I just looked at that. And then in 1979, Universal did a version of Dracula with Frank Langella that's actually very good. Much more romanticized, but very good. Then Hammer did a ton of Dracula movies. Hammer, as you know, Hammer Films is a movie house out of England. And they were big horror fans back in the 50s. And they made a lot of, I would say, known schlocky films. But they did a ton of Dracula. And those are the Draculas that have Christopher Lee in it. Christopher Lee's probably, next to Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee's probably one of the most well-known Dracula actors of all time. For you James Bond fans out there, in case you're not sure, of course, Christopher Lee played Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, which I think was his first movie after he finished doing Draculas. But Hammer did 9 Dracula movies with Christopher Lee between 1958 and 1974. There's a ton of other Dracula productions. And then, of course, in the 80s, probably the one that was most well-known, Francis Ford Coppola, of course, did Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992. Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, Keanu Reeves, Anthony Hopkins. You've seen that one. In the last, say, 20 years, we've had a few Draculas. Dracula 2000, promoted as Wes Craven Presents Dracula 2000. Let's see. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I know how crappy that movie is. That had kind of a Dracula in it. Van Helsing in 2004. Trying to think of some others. Dracula Reborn. Dracula the Dark Prince. Dracula Untold came out in 2014. So there have been a ton of Dracula-based films. But nothing beats the original. 1931, Bela Lugosi. So that's it. That's Dracula. And that is the first of our Pop Goes the Classics. I hope you enjoyed it. We are going to continue here in the month of October to give you more great classic horror podblasts of Pop Goes the Classics. As a matter of fact, if you're listening to these chronologically, the next one we're going to do is another one that came out in 1931. This one just as successful. I'm talking, of course, about Frankenstein, led by the legendary Boris Karloff. And Boris Karloff played Frankenstein a hell of a lot more than Bela Lugosi played Dracula. But that's for another episode. And we're going to cover the big 6 this month. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, and yes, the Creature from the Black Lagoon. Because those are the 6 heavyweights. We may do The Bride of Frankenstein, because that's technically just as big a deal. Now, all told, I know we started in 1925 or 23 with Hunchback of Notre Dame. Technically, the Universal Monster Collection, or the universe, went 25 years. I mentioned it earlier, from 1931 to 1956. 1931, of course, was the first year of Dracula and Frankenstein, and then 1956 was the last of the 3 Creature from the Black Lagoon movies. By then, horror had kind of lost its luster. Bela Lugosi had died. He passed away in 1956. I wanted to make that clear. He had died of a heart attack, but he had a severe addiction to morphine, which might have been the precursor to heroin. If you ever see the movie Ed Wood with Johnny Depp, Martin Landau plays a tremendous Bela Lugosi in that movie and really accentuates his drug issues in the 50s. Also, by the late 50s, Boris Karloff was getting older. He didn't feel like putting all that makeup on anymore. He still wanted to do horror and thrillers, but he wanted to just be like a regular actor and do regular roles without having to wear all that makeup by the time. He was in his 50s, I think, by then. And by the late 50s, horror in the U.S. kind of tailed off, and the Europeans took over, particularly the Italians. And down the line, we had great movies from Dario Argento, Mario Bava, and Fulci, and some great European horror throughout the 60s. And of course, as I mentioned, Hammer did a bunch of stuff from England. I would say that the U.S. didn't probably take horror back until probably The Exorcist in 1973. And by then, we got out of monsters, we got into the Satan and the devil. And then, of course, we moved on to The Omen. And then, of course, by then we would have, Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. We got to slashers. So horror went in phases. And we'll check out PlaceBeNation.com and here on the Pop Feed, and we'll talk about the stages of horror throughout history, particularly in the United States. But in 1931, with Bela Lugosi, it was all about music, silence, cameras, and thrills. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this Podblast, the inaugural episode of Pop Goes the Classics. My name is Scott Criscuolo. Enjoy.